evening, welcome back. We are moving on to our last panel of the day, from gatekeepers to gate openers. I kindly invite the participants of the panel to join me on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please come to the stage. And this panel will be moderated by Mátyás Kohán, foreign policy analyst at Mandiner.
Well, hello, and I wish everyone a wonderful evening. It is your moderator, Mátyás Kohán, speaking, and I welcome all of you who made it through the day, to the last panel of the day. I think we have our pledge that we can make to make you feel good about your decision. I'm pretty sure that our panelists are going to do everything for that, and as I know some of them, I'm pretty sure they are going to have significant success achieving that goal. Let me present them first. We have with us today Birgit Kelle, a well-known German columnist and journalist, one of the best people to turn to in the German-speaking world when it comes to questions of gender, questions of family, questions of women's affairs. She's also an activist, an author of 4 best-selling books. My favorite one of them is Noch normal, das lässt sich gendern. Still normal, let's gender something about it. This book is one of the best reasons to learn German, to understand the pun hidden in the title. At least that is a very great reason for anyone who's not had the chance to learn German to do so immediately. We also have with us today Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, prolific Paris-based journalist and columnist. It's very hard to list all of the outlets she's written for, but she can mostly be encountered on the pages and airwaves of BBC, Deutsche Welle, Arte, The Daily Telegraph, C News, Unheard, CapX, and Perspective magazine. She's written a great book on liberalism in Europe and is the co-founder and vice president of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute in Paris. We have with us Tóth Loretta, a seasoned Hungarian colleague, a foreign policy writer for Magyar Nemzet, one of the most prestigious Hungarian dailies, and an expert on diplomacy, which is international relations jargon for diplomacy conducted over Twitter. That is a phenomenon we journalists love to death, but diplomats freak out about. We also have with us today Jano Garcia, Spanish journalist, director of the digital outlet El Liberal, a great explainer of history, politics, and economics on social media, and a prolific writer. He's published The Century of Criminal Socialism, The Great Manipulation, and his new book, The Herd, on how the West succumbed to ideological tyranny. And last but definitely not least, Michael Mosbacher, journalist, co-founder of Standpoint and The Critic magazines, head of the Livable London Project at Policy Exchange, co-author of the great book, The Brexit Revolt, on the background of the UK's decision to leave the European Union. We are here today to talk with them about the phenomenon of gatekeeping, or rather gate opening. Because in our great profession, it is our job to open the gates to you. But we need to have the best possible way to open the right gates, and let's see through them the right information. And for that, we have our first topic that we have to delve into, which is the problem of selection. How does a journalist find the best way to select information? Does selection equal disinformation? Now, which considerations are legitimate in journalists' decisions on what sources to use or not to use, what information to include or exclude in their articles? Which ones, in turn, are illegitimate? I'd ask each and every one of our panelists, starting with Birgit, to weigh in shortly on that affair.
You know, I think at first we have to if we choose what to take for an article, what news or what, we always have to select, you know, because we don't have the place for everything. So it's always a selection if you write on a topic. There is no other way to do this. And I think for me as a journalist, when I decide what to take and what not to take, or what I'm writing about, it is, you know, you can say it's the truth. You know, you have to select the truth, and the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So it's like in a witness stand for me. I feel it as a duty to write only the truth. when I'm talking about a topic. And we heard the whole day, you know, there is no objective news. There's always, we all have our subject point of view. And this is maybe the hardest thing in the work as a journalist, to divide this. So to write on a topic and bring the whole truth, and also and divide it from your own opinion. Now, I am mostly I'm writing in my books. I write about facts. But my daily work is more writing comments. So it's easier there to show where I stand. But we can't leave it to others to decide which facts we choose. So it's always our job to take the stand and to decide on our own, and just the orientation is only truth.
Yeah, the opening question really, I mean, all editing is selection. I mean, it's impossible to have a magazine which doesn't select content. The purpose is readers, if they can decide whether they like the selection of that title or not. But I mean, that's the core thing of what editing is, selecting content, choosing what you think is important, what you think is less important. I don't think there's any sort of objective standard you can set to that. I mean, you can, the editors will have their opinions, which you can like or not like. They should be honest in the interpretation of their opinions. They should, I mean, not express... Obviously, once you're in the game of expressing views you don't hold for some other purpose, you're in a very sticky wicket. But, I mean, all editing is selection, and even all writing is selection. I mean, what sort of journalism is it? You don't want an article which just churns out every fact about something. It's the writer's opinion of what matters, and then it's the editor's opinion of whether they think that's someone we want to have in this magazine, whose opinion we value on that topic. So I think newspapers without selection is like wading through 20 tons of Twitter all day long. I mean, it won't get you anywhere. I mean, that'd be the sort of starting point there, really.
This is going to be very boring because I agree that, of course, there's no way you can not select when you're writing, when you're editing. I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian and say that I actually believe that there's such a thing as objective truth, as long as you don't say that it's complete truth. Complete and perfect doesn't exist. But what makes the profession of journalism, and it's really a profession, you learn it, you're very bad at the beginning and then you learn things, we hope. And it's really sort of thing, there's a basic sort of honesty in approaching something. The first thing when, usually, and the best way to create journalists is to create people who first are going to be reporters. Because even though it's incredibly boring to be sent out to car accidents, train accidents, riots, people that have lived for 1 week without electricity because of the electrical line broken by the snow. All of these are things that I did at the beginning of my career, and I do not think necessarily fondly on all of those. But it teaches you to... First of all, it teaches you to look at things. And second, it teaches you to realize you meet people, you do not know these people, they do not think like you. They have sort of been hit with reality in a completely sort of physical manner. And the way they react to it is not necessarily the way you would, which should teach you something very important. And therefore, such a thing as objective truth, whether it's a demonstration and you might get some things wrong just because you can't be in 4 places at once, and you might forget things. But you are going to strive to get it right. And so I believe that that is what distinguishes sort of journalism from, various accounts. And there are standards in this, and I think most journalists actually know exactly what those standards are. You can go somewhere with an opinion as long as part of the selections, somebody tells you, somebody possibly whom you really would not like to have a friend tells you something that is uncontrovertible, and it makes you change your opinion because you have been hit with facts. And that to me is the most important part of selection, and it brings you to a better level. And I might add that, over years and decades, you learn every day. Your memory, when it doesn't fail, reminds you of, different things that evoke the same problem that you're seeing the next day. And I would say, do not let anyone write actually commentary before a certain age, because otherwise they're going to lack the fact that, simple truth and difficult truth and just something that you believe was right and it isn't, is the thing that will help you shape this sort of strange and incredibly unexact mosaic that makes an article. Finally, I select also when I get to writing nowadays, and I'm lucky enough that I write both analysis and opinion, is the way to look at things, and it's up to how am I going to write this, is if you were to tell your best friend or your mother or someone, what was this like, and what would be the first thing you say, and that's the beginning of your piece. What is going to grab people? What do you think is the thing that you will remember when you've forgotten everything else about it? And that's usually how you start your piece, and then you go on from that. And that's essentially because you create a kind of commonality of both take and experience with the people you're talking to, your readers or your audiences when it's television. And this is how one selects. One selects with a combination of experience, trying to share this in the most effective way, and trying to be entertaining, because as the previous panel said, the readers do not have to read your stuff to the end, and if you bore them in the beginning, they will not read any of it. And for a long time, in various newspapers, and the more highbrow and less popular the paper, the more boring some of the pieces were, because there were no metrics. But now we know exactly when the readers read, and we know also when they scroll, and therefore this reminds journalists of what they should be doing. So entertainment, accuracy, shared experience, all of this is part of the selection process.
Well, I don't want to repeat my prestigious colleagues, so I would approach your question from a different angle. So I would ask that, does a journalist select at all nowadays? Does we journalists do a good job with selection? Because I have the impression that nowadays the traditional media publish everything which you can find in the social media. So I have the impression that we do nothing more, just repeat what you can find in Twitter sphere and on the Facebook. And I have the impression that the main mission of informing became a secondary after the entertainment. So I think that what is more important than the selection is the framing, because nowadays the more extreme or astonishing an opinion or a statement is, the more likely you will find it on the most prestigious website as well. So the main thing that how journalists frame a particular story in his article, because this is what we can make a unique impression for the readers.
Well, I think that when you talk about selections, it depends on what you're looking for. If you want to be a journalist, that you just want to serve to the people. Otherwise, if you want to be under control of any political party, then you will choose different things. In my opinion, I think that nowadays, what's happening with journalism, I'm not a journalist, that's what I do, but I have studied economy. And what I have seen in the last years is nowadays journalists, they just looking for serve any political party or any idea. So, in fact, I think the important thing is you have to choose the facts, what really affect us. I know that nowadays on the public debate, we really talk about what the media wants us to talk. I mean, we don't choose which is the important thing issue, what is not. So we just talk about whatever the media says we need to talk. And there is a new way that nowadays what's happening in, you talk about Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the social media, that we have seen these public debates that it doesn't really make any sense. There's just stupid things that it doesn't really affect us, but everybody talks about it. So that's something that the politicians in that case, they use it just to don't talk about important things. So in my opinion, and what I do in my life is just trying to talk about the facts. You named the last books, and I talk about important things, important issues that really affect us. But you ask something that what is not legitimate to do. I think lie is the only thing that the journalist cannot never do. I mean, you have to follow the facts and you have to present the facts. It doesn't really matter. Obviously, we all have our different opinions about difference of facts, but you have to present the facts, and then every single one will take a different opinion. But what's happening nowadays, and we have seen in the last decades, and especially in the last years, is now journalists, they just lie every single day, especially the traditional newspapers. So that's why social media and all this phenomenon, there's a lot of people, they don't trust the traditional media anymore. They don't used to watch television that they used to do in the past. And now we have seen this YouTube and all these different platforms getting with more audience because people have realized that it's not honesty in the journalism nowadays.
As you're all terrific journalists, you have been talking about legitimate aspects you can weigh if you're selecting materials for your story. But let's talk a bit about illegitimate ones. And speaking of that, government's role in the media, you have briefly touched on a related issue, parties. Jano, let me just tell you all a short story about that. I've been to Istanbul a couple of weeks ago, and I had a chance to watch hotel television during my nights. And at my hotel, there was like a great selection of foreign news channels. There was also CGTN. And I spent a lot of my time at nights watching CGTN, China's global television network, because at that time, the program they usually ran was African economy. Now, from the one hand, that program was Chinese propaganda. It spent like every 10 minutes or 15 minutes, there was like some spiel about the latest Chinese great economical program that's going to save Africa from poverty. But there was also, on the other hand, information nobody else seems to cover about the African economy. And that raises a question. Now that most of the world's important powers, like Russia, like Germany, like the United States, have state-sponsored media outlets that serve the audiences abroad. Russia has Russia Today, which seems to be the primary source of news in Latin America. Germany has Deutsche Welle. The United States has Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. China has, apart from CGTN, a lot of other outlets. What is the role a government can even play in media that's outside of its own jurisdiction? What is government's role in abroad, in international media? Is that propaganda, or are those just ways we need to know about of looking at the world? And I would like to pick on Anne-Elisabeth for this question, because she's been working for both Deutsche Welle and France 24.
And the BBC, and I've appeared on RT, and and I now refuse to go on Al Jazeera.
So she's pretty competent in that matter. Please, Anne-Elisabeth.
All I can say is it's like good or bad wine, essentially. I mean, you know when it's bad. And it is perfectly obvious that some channels, and we're talking right now, we say media, and it's really television that we're talking about, and their attended websites. And there are channels which are pursuing the country, the host, I mean, the country, foreign policy. And I'm pretty sure that CGTN ran wonderful things about, what Belt and Road was going to do for the economy of the world. And RT is very different. I mean, the way RT behaves, and I have no idea how it does here, but in French and English, essentially RT is looking for topics that are going to show a Western nation in a bad shape. And this is actually inherited from the Soviet era. In the Soviet era, there was something that came, we call this in the business a chestnut. There would be a subject almost every year, and every summer and every winter they had two topics that they would do and film in Paris, and that would be, they would go to Poilane. Poilane is an extremely fancy bread maker, baker on Rue du Cherche-Midi, and at the time there was only one shop, and it makes this sort of extremely sort of sophisticated, old-fashioned peasant bread. So people queue for it. So there would be Russian television, not called RT at the time, but they would come and they would film queues for bread in France, and that told the people in the Soviet Union that people queued for bread. And in the summer they would go to Bertillon, which is a place that does extremely good ices and sherbets, and people queue because for a long time there was only one shop. And same thing in the summer, you know, they want food and they queue for food. And RT today does a more sophisticated version of exactly that, and you can tell what it's like. In all those channels are different, and sometimes they change policies. And I must say, there's a nice channel in the Emirates who ask me stuff from time to time, and I say yes. And their policy has changed with the Abraham Accords. And it's very interesting that you can see that suddenly, you know, wonderful things about peace in the Middle East, which was not absolutely not the subject of debates beforehand. You look at them, you think, okay, they're more or less noxious, and what do? Al Jazeera not only does propaganda that is essentially propaganda trying to explain that it's a combination of Islamism and wokeism, and it's pretty toxic, which is why now I'm always busy when they ring me up. But it's really, I mean, they have an outlet in France which is a cross between a sort of subset of television channel and a YouTube and TikTok channel. It's called AJ Plus, and they deliver little sort of filmlets of 3-4 minutes. And these absolutely sort of justify any kind of accusation about French society, about how racist it is, and they twist everything. And that's like Nazi propaganda. I mean, but it's done with beautiful girls and who have Instagram accounts, and and who, of course, do not wear the clothes that they want other women to wear. And that's really an example of something that is essentially pursuing war in another way. And next to this, you've got our sort of national broadcasters in our various countries, and Deutsche Welle is a really nice example because they are what we expect of, you know, Germany, especially if we live on cliches, you know, cars and fridges that work and that are reliable, that are not especially sexy, but they're nice. And that's exactly what they produce. They're very, very serious about sort of checking your information. They ask people scrupulously from every party if they have a debate, and it's very nice to work with them. And the BBC is, we've heard in the previous debate, and I was very happy to hear Sam Leith of The Spectator saying that, you know, defunding the BBC the way other people would like to defund the police would lead, even though it's got a bias, an obvious bias, it would lead to Britain being more divided and more polarized. It probably would be a bad thing. And you can also tell that there are standards, and I mean not just standards in the way they produce things, but the fact is that essentially they have standards. They will both at the same time they will exhibit bias, but they will still keep to journalistic standards. They will not say something that is wrong. They will not broadcast something that does not have somebody from the other side to give an expression. And they do this from the strength of decades of sort of really good television. So all those things are different, but there are 3 or 4 categories, and it starts from the people who can sort of, you know, the Swiss are wonderful too. The Swiss and the Germans are really incredibly sort of careful about the reporting they do. France 24, which Jacques Chirac, our wonderful president, you know, he said he was going to create CNN Française, French CNN, which people said, yes, he dislikes the Americans so much that he wants something that would be purely French against CNN, which he saw as a state media, which it isn't. And actually, the other thing which you have to take into account when you see national broadcasters, especially if they're in what I will call, for shorthand, free countries, is that a staff of journalists working together for a period of time, they grow organically. It's like any place where you've worked. You know, the place has a character, the people you work for have a character, and France 24, I think, is actually a really good channel. And this is not something that we expected, because French television has tended to be extremely kind to people in power and not so kind to people who are not in power. But I'm you can see bits of French policy that France 24 dutifully reports, but they don't lie about it. They're very factual. And so you can see that if you let journalism, like most human endeavors, is something completely organic, and you've got to let it develop, and you see the result after a while. Years ago, when I was a wee nipper, I was on the launch of Channel 4 News in Britain. And Channel 4 News in the beginning was absolutely held to ridicule by everybody elegant in the British press, saying this is stupid, it will never catch on, it's bad, oh my gosh, they've goofed again. And it turned out, of course, to be sort of now one of the great mainstays of British broadcasting. Indeed, it is liberal, but, you know, it's a good channel. So who knows, it's entirely possible that after its travails at its beginning, GB News might become a respectable kind of British Fox News. I'm not entirely holding my breath, but possibly. And so we're talking about human beings working, and as long as their government is not actively telling them, report this or that, and you know which governments tell them to report this or that, we can tell the difference between a state broadcaster, which is supposed, even though they don't always do it perfectly, will bring a sort of balanced tale of the account of the news and of opinion, which will reflect what the country is talking about, which is the best you can do, because at the end of the day, the internet makes us think that we're all similar, and we actually know that French, British, Germans, Hungarians, Poles, etc., they're all very different, and we buy the same things from sometimes the same shops, and we think that we are the same, and hiding those differences is probably one of the most dangerous things to do nowadays. So that's my complicated and too long answer on national broadcasters.
But an exciting one as well. So I'd like for Birgit to be the next one to answer, and I also like to provoke her a little, because we're in Hungary right now, which is prime operating territory for German abroad media and RFE, RL as well. And we have encountered in our journalistic practice many reports. We have sort of grown to write a brand new genre of German media satire about articles that the German public radio, public television, and Deutsche Welle, like the international public television runs, that are like, well, comically over-the-top propaganda materials about Hungary. I remember writing like a relatively successful piece on ZDF reporting on a Hungarian gypsy settlement where they asked some active participants of Hungarian domestic policy to weigh in as completely independent observers of politics, and a politically engaged pastor to weigh in as a completely independent pastor. So a question to you and then to everybody else as well is, how do we make sure that there's a significant difference between Deutsche Welle and CGTN? How do we know that one of them is propaganda and the other one is not?
I don't know if we can answer this. I think there is a difference, because when I see how Russia Today is working and what they are really doing with their news work in Germany, I've been myself contacted for 2 years now. I think Russia Today is trying to involve me in its work, and not only me, but also a lot of other freelance and conservative journalists. They try to get us for comments, to criticize my own government. And I think this is very different from things Deutsche Welle is doing. They are harmless, you know, so in comparison. But I don't know if we should really talk about journalism when we talk about state broadcasting system. I'm not sure. For me, for example, what the national broadcasting system in Germany, the official one for the German, is doing, this is much more propaganda than I see in Deutsche Welle. So, and I'm not sure if this is really journalism at all. So, because you know there's a problem. You know, we should be on different sides. The state should not do journalism. We are the journalists, they are the politicians, we criticize them, we watch them, but this is not the same job. So for me, it's a big problem that the state is doing journalism. And we know in Germany, for example, a lot of, some of our political parties own a lot of newspapers. The socialists, for example, own a lot of newspapers, and people just don't know. They buy these newspapers, they think this is journalism, and they just, there is no transparency that you see that this newspaper is made by a political party. You know, this is propaganda, this is not journalism. So I think maybe we should criticize at all that states are doing journalism, because this is not their job.
Loretta, Michael, and Jano.
So actually, I think we have to keep in mind that in the case of foreign broadcasting services, we are speaking with public diplomacy tools. So this is a tool of the soft power which aims to influence an audience in a foreign country. So in this case, really, it's a subset of propaganda. And of course, it has differences between RT or Sputnik News and BBC. We feel differences, but this is a sort of perspective, I think, because if you think about how people related with these contents in the Middle East, they have a completely different impression about the BBC and the RT, and they like more those contents which are broadcasting by the Russian channels, and maybe this is the reason why in the Western world we have a very bad, the RT and the Sputnik News has a very bad reputation, because RT and the Sputnik News like to put the West in a bad light. So maybe the different perspectives we can meet in these different broadcasters.
Well, I have to say the short answer will be propaganda, but the long answer, and it's a question I think all of us will try to answer, is what has to do a good government? Because when we talk about this public media being ruled by the state or the government, you talk about Russian today, you talk about TNT, there's a lot of media nowadays that Chinese government is using to attack the West. But the question is I mean, a good government, I know it's not ethical what I'm going to say, but a good government has to do that. They have to defend their interests. Because this is not journalism, as he said before. Obviously, this is not journalism, it's just activism. But if they talk about Poland or you talk about Hungary, what's happening nowadays, as you have seen, there is a lot of attacks against them. But I think the problem is the Hungarian government or the Polish government, they don't use their resources to defend themselves. Because when we talk about these medias on Russia Today, for example, they have a lot of followers. If you talk to Hispano America, there is a lot of people reading Russian Today. And every single day, Vladimir Putin, what he's doing is defending his own interests, of Russia's interests. So the question is, I know it's not ethical, but the thing is, has to do a good government this? My answer is yes. You have to do propaganda if you want to defend your own interests. Otherwise, what you will get is what we're seeing today, that's happening in Hungary, Poland, and in other countries, that they're losing that battle, that fight against another countries. So in that case, it's not journalism at all, I have to say. I agree with her. It's not journalism, it's activism. But you have to do it. I know it's not ethical, I repeat. I know that's something that may, some people who study in journalism say, oh, how can you say that? But the reality is not what we like. The reality is what it is. Nowadays we're fighting against these Chinese governments and also with the Russian government. And we have seen in the West, there's a lot of countries. We talk about BBC, or we can talk a lot about another media. What they're using is just selling the agenda the leaders want to sell. And someone has to try to fight against it. And this is basically my opinion about the public is obviously propaganda, but someone has to do it.
Yeah, I'd disagree with those last comments. I mean, if we give up, what then happens? I mean, we can't say these people are doing a terrible job in presenting propaganda. The BBC World Service should be turned into propaganda. I mean, that clearly isn't the answer to combating what Chinese and Russian state propaganda is doing. I mean, I think RT Chinese state propaganda should really be taken out of the equation of a news broadcaster, because it isn't news. I mean, you've acknowledged it isn't news, but it is propaganda. It's not just propaganda. The people who are doing it don't think it's news. I mean, when they're reporting on queues outside Poulain in Paris, that's not, the person making that report doesn't think this shows that there are huge food queues in France. They know they're pushing lies. So I've got to differentiate between broadcasters who are purposely pushing out lies. And the answer, obviously, to that isn't for Western broadcasters to do the same thing. On the BBC World Service thing, and the BBC culture more generally, I'm sure you've heard lots of comments about this today. Clearly, the culture of the BBC, of its staff, is overwhelmingly left liberal. Clearly, I mean, in BBC, you're much more likely in the BBC World Service to hear criticism of the British government policy than defences of it. But because of the culture of the BBC, that's only, I think, only part of the story. And I think it's different if you look at the home broadcasting by the BBC. It's how they report on UK news is quite different from how they report on foreign news. The BBC's got this culture of balance. That their reporting on British political stories has to be balanced. So, strangely, when the Brexit campaign happened in the UK back in 2016 and after that, most Brexit supporters and most Brexit campaigns would say the broadcaster which gave them the fairest hearing was the BBC, and probably Channel 4 News gave them the least fair hearing. It's because the BBC, the state broadcaster, even though its journalists, lots of them were appalled by what they had to broadcast. Lots of them thought they had to be balanced between the side they believed to be right, remain, and the side they believed to be wrong, and I believe to be right, leave. But it led to the news broadcast of the BBC, contra to their own political culture, being much more balanced than anything you'd find on Channel 4 News or ITV News. And I think that culture is important. Where it doesn't work is in foreign news reporting. So if you have a report on Hungary, it will be completely biased, and that's largely because it's not seen as particularly important. Or even reports on Trump are not seen as important or as vital for balance as the comeback which would come from reporting on UK news. So what you have, if you have the right sort of culture, you can have broadly balanced reporting on UK political stories. You won't on the news programmes themselves. I mean, once you move to other cultural issues, once you move to issues of trans or Black Lives Matter outside main news programmes, it won't be balanced at all. I mean, it will all be very propagandistic or of that sort of left liberal stance. But you now have this bizarre thing where the BBC is being attacked on the one hand by people from my direction for its overall left liberal bias, but now the pro-Remain, the people who still think that Brexit was terrible and should be reversed, regard the BBC also as the enemy. Because in their worldview, which I think is obviously wrong, but in their worldview, the BBC gave equal weight to the chairman of Marks and Spencer's and some pro-Brexit small businessmen. And they think this is an affront. So actually the balance on the domestic broadcasting of British news, I think, tends to work with the BBC. And as you can clearly see with the different things like Channel 4 News and ITV during the Brexit debate, obviously there isn't as much of a multiplicity of voices. New channels might be the answer and all of that. But the idea that you've got to counter in the UK's overseas broadcasts, that you should counter propaganda by us turning like them, I think it's a road to oblivion. It should be avoided at all costs.
So, Anne-Elisabeth, you seem to be very interested in reacting when Jano was talking. Is that still the case, or did Michael sort of say what you wanted to?
It's two words, is that the one thing that was brought up by the previous panel is really important. You've got a bias that has been so much integrated within the minds of many of the reporters on some of those channels, and the BBC is a good example, and the French the state radio channels especially is also another one. It's not something that the government is asking you to do. It's just that these people have got cliches in their minds and they follow those cliches and nobody punishes them for that. But it's not the same thing as the state telling you you've got to do that. If they say, oh, Hungary doesn't have our values, which is something I had to debate on French television not long ago, meaning, of course, they have no values that we need to respect. It absolutely, the participants, I mean, the whole panel was skewed to think that how could you not hate Viktor Orbán and how could you not think that he's a fascist? And they'd never been to Hungary.
Right. So before we hand over to the audience, which I think is rapidly approaching, we have to touch on one more issue, and I think we should begin with Loretta on that topic. And that topic is, if we want to be gate openers, we also have to open gates that the audience doesn't necessarily want open that much. That means we have to write to them about stuff that's outside of the normal domestic policy news cycle and the celebrity news cycle. We have to talk to them about foreign policy, about issues that concern them through concerning faraway nations. We have to talk to them about science. We have to talk to them about, well, especially in the coronavirus pandemic, medical information that they may or may not want to hear. And I know your answer to the question of how we get that information across is going to be, well, we have to write well, but I'm not going to let you go with that answer. How do we actually, what are the strategies to open gates to the audience that the audience does not know they want open? Loretta.
Hi, it's me. So I think this is a hard question because we live in a world where we need the latest information immediately. So we are forced to trust in other journalists who are on the spot. Like in the case of Afghanistan, we are not there. I've never been there. I don't know how it works, the situation there. So I have to trust those few journalists, correspondents who are still there. But the main problem is that in these cases you get the information in an ideologically motivated framework, or I can say that you get the information filtered through someone's glasses, you know. And I think the main task of a journalist to go beyond these frameworks constructed by other journalists and try to find the real facts behind these adjectives and plus information, because I had a very strange experience when I started to follow the spokesperson of the Islamic State of Afghanistan, the Mujahid Zabidullah, maybe you also follow, and he's a very professional communicator, very sophisticated. He knows how he has to speak for the Western words, and I realized that a lot of times when he's arguing, it's an extreme view, but he could be the spokesperson of the Hungarian government as well, because he makes in points why the Human Rights Watch international NGO latest report make a mistake with Afghanistan. And I find it very strange that the Human Rights Watch use the main words and the same words for the Taliban government and the Hungarian government, and why I should believe an NGO like which spreading the same news about the Taliban and the Hungarians, and why journalists feel compelled to amplify these voices which is spreading in Twitter.
Hanno, please.
Well, I want to say something that is very interesting when we talk about Afghanistan. The FBI, they tried to justify the invasion and they wanted to use it in a gender way. They're just defending the women's rights. There was a report, I think it was about 2 months ago, that was out for the first time. And there was another way to try to get these issues importance, and then the people will support it. So that gave us his clue about how things could be working, you know, when you're trying to solve these things. It's very interesting because you can realize there's a lot of people that were criticizing the invasion in Afghanistan, and we've been very worried about it, what's happening in Afghanistan, but only for 2 weeks. Nobody knows exactly what's going on nowadays in Afghanistan. In fact, we don't even care about it anymore. We have forget about the women's rights and all these issues. So, what was the question, sorry, Barry?
How do we open gates to the audience that they don't necessarily want open? How do we present to them information that's outside of the most popular topics of outside of domestic and celebrity news cycles?
So you mean topics that are from the outside, which are important and not domestic?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays and the world we're living, obviously it's very important what's happening. When we talk about Afghanistan, it's very important what happened there. For example, it's very loose for the West. I mean, people criticize the United States, but in fact, it's given us the decadency of the West. China is getting better and better in these issues. You talk about Africa before, and China is doing a lot of business there. So, but I know that's not easier if you're trying to explain to the people because they don't really very interested on all these kind of issues. But this is something that journalism has to do. I mean, as I said before, what we talk about is what the journalists they want us to talk about. So if you have in the media every single day talking about these issues, people will get concerned about the importance of these things that's happening in other places. Otherwise, if you prefer to talk about things that they don't really affect us at all, then we're not going to have that kind of issue. So I think journalism and journalists has to work in that way, even though at the beginning it's not popular, even though at the beginning you may don't have a lot of audience. If they work hard on it, you will get these issues in the public debate.
My message to Michael is that he's now on, but before that, a message to the audience, please, if you have questions, this would be the time to turn them in. We're going to get to them in a matter of, well, 5 to 8 minutes. So, Michael, please.
Yeah, the question, a few points. How do newspapers, broadcasters deal with important topics which people are less interested in? I mean, the answers there aren't terribly exciting. It is sort of making the stories interesting, decent journalism, all the rest of it. But more interesting, I think, why the problem's got much worse is precisely something you raised earlier. Now that newspapers are, newspapers more than magazines, but newspapers to a large extent are consumed digitally, the publishers know precisely what people are reading and precisely how many responses everything gets. And it's the public's fault. To a large extent, obviously not entirely, but the public, what then happens is that reinforces itself. So newspapers realise that shouty opinion pieces are what people come to read, so that'll lead to more shouty opinion pieces. The problem's got much worse because of the way media is consumed now. If you consume media in a way where you get very precise, vastly detailed data back as to what's being read, why people are reading it, how long they're on every article, that the stuff they read will be reinforced. Newspapers will produce more of what people want to read, and I think that's one of the reasons why mainstream papers have got more noisy about these things, more shouty. On the other hand, the other problem there with issues raised is that, I mean, particularly in the left to centre press and on the BBC, there's an idea that certain issues are important. So I'm not saying it's not an important issue, but most reporting on global warming and the current talks in Glasgow is incredibly boring. I mean, it's very difficult to make these stories even remotely interesting. I can't really believe there's huge demand for extra news segments and programmes to have long discussions about COP26, because the discussion never goes very far. And I think most people aren't really very interested in reading whether you should move from boilers to new forms of heaters. But I mean, that I think is worthiness, why you get so much. It might be, these might be the most important issues there are, they might not be. But as news stories, they are dull. And the reason you get so much of that sort of dull stuff is sort of worthiness and what papers think they need to do. In the case of The Guardian, there's also the aspect that for a newspaper, which Britain's main left-wing paper, The Guardian, is that it gets a lot of funding that way, both through, it's now pushed just last week, The Guardian's now got this model where it writes to its subscribers, not subscribers, it writes to anyone on the site and asks them for money. And there's obviously a niche of people who are sort of very concerned on global warming. It's both pushing that on that side, and it's also getting funding from large foundations who are concerned about these sort of issues. So, I mean, that pushes certain stories as well from that point, which you can raise, which are easier to fund. But I do generally think that the general point is the way news is consumed now and what the public bites. The public, it's very difficult for profit-centred publishers to, if they see that endless articles on trans in conservative papers get lots of clicks, you'll get more of those articles. and not other issues raised. If you look at the Telegraph at the moment, there's an awful lot, there's so much culture wars stuff. That's because that's what people read on the Telegraph site. It isn't some sort of magic thing. It isn't that, it's what people read and the magazines responding to that. And I mean, that would be true of any other consumer good where you've had better data beforehand. But if there's a solution to that, I don't know. Get the public to have different concerns. But I mean, I don't know how that's done.
Well, Anne-Elisabeth, we asked you this question a week ago in an email chain, and you were kind enough to answer, well, you just have to write well. You can write interestingly about everything. So just journalist to journalist talk on the stage. We're pretty much all journalists. How'd you do that?
That was when we prepared the debate. I mean, there's a limit to what you can do, and quite honestly, if you're a journalist, you're a grown-up, and you know that if you're working for Elle magazine, you're not working for the Times, although the difference is getting narrower, but you're not working for, say, the Financial Times, and there are audiences where you're not going to do foreign policy. There are media where if you want to do foreign policy, you know, brush up your CV, keep working, and then apply somewhere else. But in publications that are general interest and daily newspapers, there are 2 or 3 ways of making complicated subjects interesting. We've talked about, you know, news like Afghanistan, and news like Afghanistan, we've seen that that was made into you had a suitable drama which had, you know, failure, repetition of history, and personal horror stories, and that was exciting enough, unfortunately, that it got on television and on the front page of papers. You had something that looked like the evacuation of the Americans from Vietnam, complete with a helicopter on the roof of the embassy. You had people who had helped the coalition and who were left behind to a terrible fate. I mean, there were lots of reasons, and you had very obviously something that, even though getting out of Afghanistan was probably what should have been done, you certainly had a way of botching it, which meant that you could always explain how people do something very badly, in this case, President Biden, and that's also something slightly exciting to write about. So it's not too difficult to actually, for a bit, to write stories about Afghanistan. But I'd like to point out, rather than, there are things that look boring and that require, as was said earlier, require money to report them over the long period of time. But if you report about, say, urbanism, if you report about corruption in construction, if you report about these things, what you actually need, and only a big outfit will be able to pay somebody who will follow this, make contacts, write pieces day in, day out, saying, you know, this small pieces, because the paper doesn't need big ones. This contract has been given, this city is going to be replanned, we've brought him an architect from abroad, we've brought him an urbanist from abroad. And then these are the people who know enough people that then one day they will break a story on why there's a whole new development of housing, and the money has gone to finance a party. You don't do this if you come brand new to this and you were doing something else before. See, all of this is a question of constance, not doing much on this, and suddenly reporting about this because you have the contacts. It takes commitment and it takes means for the newspapers, and that's not so easy. But I wanted to point out, and that's the last thing, when we discussed this by email, this panel, I said that it is always possible, if you know enough about something, to write it in a very, very good way. And it can be the writing of an extraordinary business journalist called Michael Lewis in America, who's written about the financial crisis of 2008, who's written, it's a book called The Big Short. It was made into a movie. It is absolutely riveting. And if you've been an economic journalist at one stage, you know that writing about subprimes is really boring. Writing about people borrowing stuff from the state to buy their homes is actually not terribly, exciting, even though it actually has to do with people's lives. A home is probably the decision to have a home, to not have a home, to buy a home is probably one of the great decisions of people's life, and it ought to be made interesting, and some writers can make it interesting, and then there's sort of incompetence and graft, and in a sort of catastrophic comedic way you can have a look at that, and all of this is in Michael Lewis's book. And so I would say that you start in journalism schools, those schools that we've been saying such horrible things about, but journalism schools should teach and show essentially make their students read lots of books by very good journalists. In the 60s and 70s, Tom Wolfe wrote about American society in a way that his books were bestsellers, and they were not necessarily bestsellers about things that you wanted to read about, but they said something about the nature of the country. So find the good writers. They're always good writers in every generation of journalists, and read them and keep reading them. And when you're writing, try and do something that wouldn't be too bad next to it. That's my only advice.
Like you wanted to respond briefly, please.
I absolutely agree with all of that. But it's quite just 2 points I wanted to make there. One was even a story as good as Afghanistan, which is as invigorating, gets people excited, gets people involved. Even there, you can start getting nonsense. So, for example, in the UK, for days of the reporting of Afghanistan started being about the evacuation of cats and dogs from Afghanistan. There's a British bloke who set up a shelter for cats and dogs. So you got days of nonsense about people
read it.
Exactly.
You know the theory that dogs have lost the internet and cats have won the internet. A perfect story is Taylor Swift goes to Afghanistan with her cat. Yeah. Everybody will read it.
Yeah, no, people read it. That was my point. Those stories will get prominence as well. It's back to what we were talking about before. And then you're absolutely right. Great writing is the way to do things. Investigations need to be done. But there's also an interesting point, because the large newspapers have cut their budgets on investigations so much. So in the UK, for example, you've recently had 2 things presented as investigations. We don't need to get into the details of them. But the Sunday Times had a story about treasurers of the Conservative Party getting peerages. And it's presented as an investigation. There was no investigation at all. What it is simply looking at the list of people who are treasurers of the Conservative Party, their published data of how much money they're given to the party, and then looking whether they've had peerages. In the past, you've had a proper investigations. It's now been replaced by something which called itself an investigation, which isn't. Or recently, there's now a row about outside work of MPs and a barrister being paid $400,000 for his work abroad. That wasn't through any in-depth work. It wasn't through any investigation by any newspaper outfit. It's simply reading what the government's what's published on the House of Commons website and the Register of Members' Interests. So you're absolutely right. Investigations are vital, but even things these days, the budget for them has collapsed so much, and newspapers have cut their costs so much, that what you've ended up with is even things which claim to be investigations not being investigations at all. Presenting facts which are publicly available. There's no harm in doing that. But my point just really is that the newspaper appetite for these sort of things has fallen so much with their profits falling.
So, as it's the case so often on this continent of ours, the Germans have the last word. Birgit, you have also been involved in the business of raising attention to topics that are not in the middle of the country's media discussion. For example, women's issues or family issues. How do you do that?
I'm writing now for years for not very entertaining topics like bioethics and gender politics. And in my experience, what really works is if you just don't only reach the brain, but also the heart of people. Facts are game changers, but people want to listen to stories. So we have to learn as journalists to tell a story, to tell about the people behind. And in my experience, especially with the gender politics, which I'm writing now for 8 or 9 years, and I make speeches about it. And the biggest problem was to explain a very difficult topic in easy words, so everybody can understand. And what we also have to do is, as journalists, we have to explain people, we have to connect to their daily life, Every big problem has an impact on your life. But if you don't understand the impact on your life, then you think this topic is not interesting or is not important for you. So I think this is high end. If you manage to explain a very difficult problem in easy words, and people understand and people act afterwards. So and what my experience also is, so I agree with Anne-Elisabeth, is we have to learn to tell, to be entertaining, I read a lot of books about gender mainstreaming, big books, and the facts are okay, but I don't know how many people really read the whole book, So what there is no need for books. Nobody reads until the end. So if you want the people to read until the bitter end, you have to write so nobody puts away this book or puts away this article. And don't forget the humor. You know, people want to laugh. I'm working a lot also with sarcasm, with irony, and with humor. Not everybody understands this. Twitter is always an experience because not everybody understands this. But it helps a lot. It helps a lot if you are writing just for normal people, so they understand. And they feel entertained, but they also understand the problem. So I read a lot of articles where the facts are all true, it's okay, but it's boring. It's boring, it's hard to understand, and nobody wants to listen to this. So if we want to be other journalists, and if we want people to listen to us, then we have to respect that we are writing for human beings.
Thank you. Q&A time. So just a disclaimer, we have 3 questions, and at this time we're not going to be able to let everybody respond to everything, because we also have to be respectful of your tummies and your patience for all the people who have been sitting through this conference all day. My first question comes from Verbovsky Sándor. Is there any kind of omerta between media in specific topics? If you're not familiar, omerta is a mafia ethics term. It's basically about people not telling on each other publicly. I would ask Anne-Elisabeth and Loretta to respond.
Okay, my answer would be that, the question is, do journalists among themselves keep quiet about some topics? And my answer is going to be from P.T. Barnum, is you can fool some of the people some of the time. You can fool some people all the time. You can fool all people some of the time, but you can't do both. It lasts for a bit and then it stops, because people get aware within the newspaper and outside, and so it may happen, but it will not last forever.
I agree with Anne-Elisabeth, but I would argue that I think journalists should represent the haute couture of news, and we need to keep in mind that the main principle of the social media, news media, is in contrast to the principle of credible information. So editorials and newsrooms should operate as Michelin-starred restaurants, and the waiters, or in our case, the journalists, should not serve anything that is on the market, only the fact-checked information.
Thank you. Next question from Gabor. It's a krik duši, as we say in Russian, so often a cry from the soul of so many Hungarians these days. How should I believe anything to Western mainstream media when I see that they tell plain, absurd lies about Hungary? Well, the task of defending Western mainstream media is going to go to Michael and Birgit.
I do think if you're talking about media which purports to be neutral, such as the BBC, I think there's a very different way, as I mentioned before, the way they report foreign news and domestic news. I think, by the way, there's an inculcated left liberal culture, which I don't think they believe what they're doing is propagandistic or misleading. I think just as they report on Trump, they think they're being fair and impartial, and how could anyone have a different point of view? I think the culture is that deeply embedded. But I do think that the foreign reporting clearly is much more problematic than domestic reporting. It's also it's partly an ideological bent, it's also which stories are interesting. So, for example, if any story about the AfD support in Germany going up is prominent not just in the BBC but across British media, it's a much sexier story than a story about some other party gaining support. Any part, Germans on the far right, Germans and Nazis, you get lots of coverage for. It's also just because the story of you get nasty Trumpistas writhing in Poland and Hungary, is a story which is appealing, amusing, has resonance, where the story about, okay, the political disagreements in Hungary, but it's these are political disagreements within the confines you'd expect in another country, isn't a particularly exciting story. That within the EU you have a move towards despotism is a story which appeals. I mean, it sounds dramatic, and news is about being dramatic and drama. You can have real drama in Afghanistan, leaving in helicopters and all the rest of it, but that story, it's three things. It's the story comes across as dramatic, the people reporting it, genuine about the story, but they believe they think they're being impartial. It's their sort of cultural mindset, and you can get away with a lot more reporting overseas than reporting within the country. There are far fewer people who'd be knowledgeable about it and could see the weaknesses of the story.
Birgit.
How can I trust Hungarian media? You know, I don't know what you are reporting about Germany, if this is everything is true. So I think we have you can tell this sentence about every country and every broadcasting system or so. I think there is no we don't only have a single mainstream media in Germany. We have so many different broadcasting systems. We have private, we have public broadcasting system, we have so many newspapers, magazines, so many different media. I think what you should do is just realize and check very different sources. I think this we should do in every country and in every on every topic. When me myself, when something really serious happens in the world, I don't watch German broadcasting system. I'm watching Fox News and CNN and stuff like this, because my very expensive broadcasting system in Germany has no time when something is happening in the world. So to get the whole picture, it's like a puzzle, you know. Maybe we should see this. The media is like a puzzle, and everybody puts his own piece of this picture in it, and we have to collect all the pieces. And you don't get this in one broadcasting station or in one newspaper, so you have to inform yourself, and this is the great thing in the digital age. You know, we get the information now. There is no chance information is not does not come to the surface. You know, you can try this as Anne-Elisabeth said, but it's only it's just a matter of time, and everything goes public through media, through social media especially also. So just check. We have to realize there is no mainstream media. We have still in Europe, I think, a big variety.
And the third question concerns my age. I'm 20, and with this, that's a wrap, and we'll call it a day. Thank all of you for your continued attention throughout the day. Thank you for this panel, to Anne-Elisabeth, Birgit, Loretta, Jano, and Michael. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming to Hungary, and please have a great evening. It's not that tough in Budapest. You're going to manage it. Thank you.
Yeah.